All right, so we're still lots to talk about with Abraham. And so I'm probably going to do like I did last week and recap a little bit from the week before. I think we may have had an issue with the recording anyways. If some of you do hope to catch things on YouTube, we've had a few issues over the last month, maybe a couple. So I'm not sure what you're able to see or not see. So I'll just kind of keep things going in terms of recapping maybe some themes, because there's a lot of similar themes. We have the theme of, we'll see today, this theme of laughing, and that's been all throughout the Abraham narrative, but just some other ideas that were going on. If you recall last week, that was when you've got this case where Abraham does the routine of Sarah's my sister again with King Abimelech and how all that went down. So I want to just share some of the observations that I shared last time from that before we get into what we're going to look at today. And one of the things, if you recall, is that Abimelech, when he had taken Sarah, and then God visited him and said, you're basically a dead man if you don't return this woman. We saw that idea that, Abimelech was, in one sense, innocent, right? But he wasn't. And even those who might seem that they're pure according to human judgment, in other words, I didn't mean to, I didn't know, whatever. The fact of the matter is not entirely, no one is really entirely free from judgment and blame, and therefore everyone needs God's grace and mercy, everybody. Not just those who are, the people that need a crutch or the people that are desperate. This kind of people like to say is the fact is everybody and everything is uncovered before him, and so we all are in need of his mercy and his protection. And we saw that it was a close call for Abimelech in that sense, and that God spared him. And so I encouraged us last week, if you recall, to consider some of those close calls in your life. Maybe times when you've been spared, even when maybe it didn't seem like it was all enjoyable at the time. Like I said, maybe there was a job you really wanted, or someone you thought you were going to marry, or whatever it might be. And the fact is, if it didn't work out, you might actually have been spared by God in those times of supposed failures or mistakes. And so don't overlook those things, just assuming that it's all just random occurrences, or you win some, you lose some kind of thing, but that God has a hand in all of that stuff. The other part that we saw is that, and we'll see a little bit today too, is that when you wrong somebody, or when someone is wronged, there are two aspects, at least two. There's sometimes more involved. But yes, you are wronging a person, like Abimelech when he said, I didn't touch her and I didn't come near her, and God said, yeah, I know you didn't. I knew what was going on, and I spared you from sinning against me, he said. And so that idea that, in addition to our impact we have on each other and even other people, anything we do really impacts God. And certainly in the case of offense to another person or causing harm to someone else, you're causing harm there, but also there's a harm in the relationship that you're committing with God as well. And then the other thing we looked at is that, kind of how Abraham, why he even did this whole thing, how he came into this land and to where Abimelech, his kingdom was, and he kind of assumed, well, no one here is going to believe in God. There's really nothing I can do. It's pretty hopeless. Therefore, instead of trying to in some way impact this situation or whatever, or be myself, I'm going to kind of go with this ruse of Sarah being my sister and so forth. And so whatever situation we find ourselves in, just like what Abraham did, the one piece that he missed, the big piece, is he just kind of had God out of the equation in that situation. And so we don't want to do that as well. Whatever situation you find yourself in, whether it seems to be something that, hey, this is within my realm of capability, this is something I can handle, maybe not, but don't forget the God factor. That's where I got Michael's amen last week, but I don't know if he's ready, if he wants to hit it again, but so anyways. Because God is in fact aware of all that stuff, of all the details and the situation, and he can go above and beyond what you can think or ask. And then also, if you recall, Abimelech, when he kind of got spared there by God, and he kind of went to Abraham and he said, I don't know if you remember what he said, but he said, what is it that you saw? What did you see? Tell me what you saw that caused you to do this thing to me. And I said, that's something that we need to be willing and open to asking of God, maybe even other trusted people in our lives, but certainly God, to show us those blind spots. What is it that you saw? Because Abimelech seemed to be at his wit's end as to why someone would do this to him. And he said, what is it that you saw in me? Like, what is it that you saw that caused you to do this? And so be open and willing to not not beat yourself up, as I mentioned, but to be honest and open for God to show you some blind spots that might be causing repetitive scenarios in your life, right? Whether it's, this always happens when I start a new job, or this always happens when I have a relationship, or when I have new neighbors, or whatever. Maybe there's something that you don't see. And so you ask God, what is it that you see? What is it you see that can help me in this case? Because it's hard when we look at all these narratives of Abraham, as we've been doing, it is hard we see all these ups and downs, and it's hard to ignore the shortcomings. We see in that case in chapter 20, right before that in chapter 19, God was saying, look, this is it. This is what's going to happen. A year from now, you're going to have the baby. You're right on the cusp of the promise. And then we see Abraham going and doing what he did, and we think, hey, well, Abraham, what were you doing? What were you thinking? But really, don't lose sight when we see these low points in Abraham's life. Don't lose sight of just saying, I want to point my finger and, tut tut, as you will, or, oy vey, Abraham, not me. But to realize that, like in chapter 20, this is just a really powerful commentary on just how patient God is with his servants, and therefore you as well. Because obviously Abraham made mistakes, and we too will make mistakes. We're going to have moments of faithlessness. But understand that, God's chosen ones, if you're here and you believe in him, he's got a purpose and a plan and it's things for you to do. You're not going to destroy those plans for him that he's got by failing. That's not just going to wipe out all the plans within. You've got to kind of concoct your plan B. And I'll conclude this wrap-up section here with what I read last week, which was from 2 Timothy 2. It said that trustworthy is the saying that if we died with him, that's Yeshua, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. And if we deny him, he will also deny us. That's a way you can kind of wipe out your plans if you have that ultimate deny. However, the next portion says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, and he cannot deny himself. So those are some things from last week. So I want to get into to today, into chapter 21, in these first few verses. And you remember that the chapter divisions and verses, they don't really exist. They exist, but they never existed, right? Originally, these are made up. Joanne Espinay put those together. She's very good at organization, so she organized the chapter and verse markings. I may not realize that. But
thanks for letting me know I did.
Yeah, that's right. You're amazing. Amaze yourself. But chapter 20 did, if we look at chapter 20, the end of chapter 20, it's really just what comes right before chapter 21. We've got this interesting comparison, or really this flow, where Abraham had prayed for Abimelech. Abimelech, he was ill, obviously. Either the men were ill where they couldn't conceive with the women, or the women had an issue, whatever it was. And Abraham prayed, and all that turned around. It said that Abimelech was healed, and every womb had become open. And then the next verse is Sarah herself gets pregnant. It's kind of interesting, I think, there. That's right with the very next verse. Sarah gets pregnant, and it's finally her time. It says, then Adonai visited Sarah just as he had said, and Adonai did for Sarah just as he had spoken. So Sarah became pregnant and gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age at the appointed time that God had told him. That's two verses, here in chapter 21. And this here is the beginning, the physical beginning of the fulfillment of the promises we've been hearing about for the last 8 chapters. The 8 chapters of the life and times of Abraham, right? And we got a few more coming. But you got 8 chapters of all this stuff and these ups and these downs and the promise and the son, and he tells them all these times you're at the time, and then boom, 2 verses, chapter 21. There it is. It happened, right? In other words, there's been a lot more time, 25 years, there's been description and discussion about life without the promise than with the promise. I was thinking, there's this thing I've been going to just about every year. I think we missed 1 year for the last 6 years, I think. The father-daughter dance. We go to it. I've seen Raphael and I've been going now too. It's once a year. Happens once a year. It's not like it changes roughly like in the wintertime every year. But I hear about it all year long. We just had it a few weeks ago, and then this past Thursday, I'd gone to the dollar store with Emanuela, and we're in there. She, oh, there's tiaras. We could get those for the father-daughter dance. And then when we get home, it's like, when's the father-daughter dance? I'm like, it's going to be in February. Is it soon? No, it's in February. And we run this drill over and over again. But eventually, the father-daughter dance comes. It comes at the scheduled time, and the father delivers. We go, and then it's over, right? In just a few hours. And I think, in like manner, we spend most of our time not thinking about like when we get something, or the arrival or the obtaining of something often, In fact, once we obtain it, it often becomes somewhat anticlimactic, And we spend most of our time, quite frankly, worrying, obsessing, desiring, feeling unfulfilled, even when the thing we've been waiting for finally comes. That we really didn't spend much time then. It's all that time beforehand, And the birth of Isaac here, it's the fulfillment of all the promises, the resolution of all the anguish, the ups and downs that we've been reading about. And yet this narrative here, these first two verses, very understated. If you read it, it's like, oh, that was quick, Yeah, the father-daughter dance over, like that was it. I told you we'd go, We went, you got chocolate on your dress like every year, That's how it goes. But it's very understated, that narrative. It's very quick, and that's really, I think, what makes it so impressive, How it just comes all at once, just as it was supposed to. Concise, direct. It's very concisely written in Hebrew. The verbs are kind of rapid fire. If you look at the verse of God came, just as he said, he did, just as he said, all at his appointed time. It's very boom, 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 It's impressive how just quick it is like that. And we can and we should be impressed by God when he delivers like that. We should be caused to be joyful when we see his blessing. So we should be impressed, but we should not be surprised by any of it, And moreover, we shouldn't be stressed about it in the meantime, in the prior time. And I think part of the observances that we have of the continual cycle of biblical holy days, at least in our community, really keeps us, I think, in the process and in the habit of being appreciative and being impressed by what God has done. It's a good practice. Even the Shabbat, remembering the works of creation, keeps us being impressed. And so whatever it might be, whether we're praying for a spouse, whether we're praying for children, either to have children or for our children, or for a job or financial provision, for physical healing, or the arrival of the father-daughter dance, whatever it might be impressed, be happy, be joyful about God's provision or solution when that comes. Be impressed, but I think not surprised. Okay? Not surprised. In verses 6 and 7, we see Sarah's reaction. She laughs again. Again, laughter has been a continual theme in these narratives. Both positive and negative. We've seen the positive laughing. We've seen the derisive laughing, which we see here as well. All based on the name Isaac. We've seen Abraham and Sarah laughing in disbelief, and now laughing in joy. And then again, we're going to see this sort of make fun of kind of laughing here. But here, Sarah's laughter is positive, and with it, she's admitting just how amazing it is, just how, the sheer impossibility and unlikeliness of this birth ever having become a reality. It's here now, and she's giving God the credit, and she's so overwhelmed that all she can do is laugh. And, that it will be temporary, as we saw, we heard Tracy already read, but for now, that laughter just erased all of that painful waiting of the past. It really did. All the stuff that we've seen in the past. And I think the fact that small thing I took out of this is that laughter is a gift. Actual laughter is in fact a gift, It's a ministering phenomena, I think, that God has given us. There are stipulations, of course, when you look at laughter in the Bible. There are times to not laugh and be joyful, and there are times, where it's not the case, where God even says, I want to turn your laughter into sorrow and that kind of thing. But in general, I think not different than, say, music. Laughter is a biblical way of receiving a newness of spirit, which just can't be explained, really. It just kind of works, right? Proverbs 15:13, for example, says a joyful heart makes the face cheerful. You may have heard people say that before, like, oh, if you're happy, notify your face, kind of thing, but a joyful heart does make the face cheerful, Everything okay? Yeah, okay, well. Or have you ever heard the other one? There's I can't remember the numbers. There's 34 muscles to frown, and it takes 12 to smile. You're working yourself to death, So laughter is a very good thing. It's a very thing that God gave us. Verses 8 through 10, we see though that the laughter motif does take a negative spin, right? Ishmael's, laughing at Isaac. It's unclear exactly what's going on there. Some want to say, well, it's not laughing, he's having fun with the child and so forth. The fact is, and certainly if you read in the Galatians, Paul has an interpretation or kind of goes off on a related drash on this in Galatians chapter 4. It's pretty clear that the laughing was done in a negative way. This was a negative, scornful laughing or mocking of some kind that's going on here. And just as in the splitting up of Abraham and Lot that we read about several chapters ago when they had to go their separate ways, it becomes clear that the best thing to do in order to avoid any future issues, between Ishmael, Isaac, and their mothers, is to send Ishmael and Hagar away. And again, kind of like it wasn't necessarily a negative thing with Lot. It's not necessarily a negative thing here, but it just needs to happen with the future things that are going to be coming. And Sarah is actually not really put in a very good light in this section here. She is likely, when you look at the social norms of, culturally, when there's a child of a maidservant and so forth, this wasn't so uncommon. There were actually laws and rules in place to allow that to actually work and for that person to have a share of the inheritance and so forth. But so she was likely bucking some social norms by, really pushing for Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. But she's really negative. You see she refers to Hagar very differently. If you go back to chapter 16, and this parallel episode where Hagar was sent out in chapter 16, she's sent out here. She refers Sarah refers to Hagar very differently in chapter 16 than she does here. There it's just more like, my maidservant. Here it's like very generic, like this slave girl. She says it twice that way. This slave girl, just this servant, very much more subservient kind of negative way she refers to her. And in verse 11, we see that this troubled Abraham greatly. And it's clear that it says he's troubled for his son. It's not Isaac he's talking about here. He's troubled because of Ishmael, because of having to send Ishmael out. That's clear as to who he's troubled or what's troubling him. Because there was no love loss between him and Ishmael. There's no love loss at all between Abraham and him. And so he was caught in the middle here. He was caught in the middle. And I think there is some relatability for many people, maybe some people here in this room today, but certainly in our society today in this verse. This verse is not so uncommon for us. It's not so uncommon for a person to have children by two different people, right? For a man or a woman, right? There can be a man who has kids, and the kids are half siblings or whatever. That's not so uncommon of a situation today, this blended family. And I'm not talking in a polygamous situation like this, but just in general, it's how it works out sometimes with multiple marriages. But so the same dilemma, I think, sometimes presents itself to people nowadays, the same dilemma that Abraham was experiencing with this animosity of one partner towards the other partner. And so I think because of that, I think we can look at, what kind of how God deals in this situation, because it is relatable to some people nowadays, maybe people here, maybe people and God's related word, I think, on that situation is that there may be times that a person has to choose between scenarios that are just not easy choices. Not everything's an easy choice or an easy decision. And in this case, this was a choice regarding the very well-being of someone's children, right? This is the choice that Abraham was facing. And ultimately, as in the case with Abraham here, there's a need to trust that God will make up for any inequalities in parenting or any provision that needs to take place, And this is some tough stuff to deal with and to live through, I believe. And it was for Abraham, and it is for people nowadays as well. And that being said, notice how this plays out, though, for Abraham, okay? Notice that Abraham didn't just follow the whim or the pressure that he was getting from Sarah, because that was there for sure, you know. She was very, like, pressuring him. But he didn't just kind of do it based on that. We've seen passivity in the Bible before, like, you know, okay, you know, this kind of stuff. But he didn't just follow that pressure. It wasn't until he received confirmation from the Lord that he followed through on that, you know, having Hagar and Ishmael separate, be dismissed. In other words, it was an impossible situation, quite frankly. And Abraham, you know, basically his hands were tied. What do I do? This is my son. What do I do? This is my son. This is the woman, the mother of my son. This is my wife now. I mean, it was basically his hands were tied. It was a nearly impossible situation. Neither decision was going to be easy, whether he decided, no, we're both are going to stay. No, I'll send him away. Neither decision was going to be easy. But we see that his action was the result of God's directive, more than it was, or completely, I think, more than it was the pressure from Sarah or the pressure from just the situation itself. Okay? And in verses 12 and 13, God there confirms his good plans for Ishmael. He reassures Abraham that it's okay to follow along with Sarah's plans. He tells him that. And so we see that sometimes, you know, things like that just have to happen. Decisions have to be made. They're not ideal. They're not desired. They could even involve a tremendous amount of heartbreak and really complete life change. But God is still there. He still cares. He's still involved. And in verses 14 to 15, we get another one of these pictures of Abraham's faith. This is when we're looking at, you know, again, backing up to, you know, Rabbi Chaim's vision for this sermon series of, you know, the faith of Abraham. This is it again. We've seen those rapid fire things that Abraham has done in the past. Remember, he went and he dwelled and he tented and this kind of stuff. We see it here again, is that he got up early, he took bread and water, gave them to Hagar Ishmael, and sent them away. It's just boom, boom, boom in the Hebrew as well. And we see him in that faith mode again, you know. So this is that thread of faithful action by Abraham that we can take encouragement from as a model, is that he faced a very, very hard task, very difficult decision. He faced it resolutely in faith, and he got up early and got after it. He didn't, I just want to lay in bed. I mean, sometimes you don't want to get up out of bed sometimes. Like you know what you got coming, you got this meeting, you got this, that, and the other, right? But that's not the way to faithfully take on something. He got up early, and he got it done. Verses 16 and 17, okay? This is, you know, where he gives her, here's your bottle of water, here's one for him, here's a bag of pretzels. Almost what it seems like, isn't it? How much could they have taken? I read about 12 different commentaries this week. Only one, and I wrote this question down as I was reading, only one person addressed this question of why didn't he take more stuff? Like, why didn't he? Yeah, Abraham wasn't like some pauper. Like, he could have given him her servants and a cart and animals and all kinds of stuff. And I thought, why didn't he do that? You know, and this is just questions that the text doesn't answer. We don't have answers to that. I mean, I think how far did he expect her to get? You know, and now some of that. This one commentator actually suggested that possibly, you know, he wanted her to stay close by. You know, go away, you know, move to, you know, the nearby city. Maybe he didn't want to get too far. We're not too sure exactly. You know, again, all that kind of stuff is speculative. But either way, it seems like he was being obedient and faithful nonetheless. I don't think he gave her meager rations for extra faith or for any particular reason. I just think the fact is he was convinced that God was going to provide for Hagar and Ishmael. That seems to be the case. And we're not sure if that's going to happen right away, because we see in verse 17 that after they, you know, didn't seem like they were gone very long. This is a desert. You ever been in the desert before? I've been one time to the sand dunes out there, you know, wherever that is. And that's not quite the desert. But if you don't have the right shoes, if you take your shoes off and step on the hot part of the sand and there's nothing, you're like, man, this would be like terrible. You drop something off in the desert. This is tough. So the point is, I don't know how they got very far. It doesn't seem they got very far. And they became exhausted and desperate, and it looked like it was going to be the end for them. But then we read that it says, then God heard the boy's voice. Okay, we get Hagar's crying, Ishmael's crying, but the text says that God heard the boy's voice, and then they got help from God. And it's interesting Hebrew at the end of verse 17, and you can look at yours because you may have a different translation where it says God heard the boy's voice. And I wrote down 4 different translations that I found. God heard the boy's voice in his present situation. God heard the boy's voice where he is. God heard the boy's voice as he lies there. God heard the boy's voice right where he is crying. These are several translations. And I'd be happy for Chaim Raylan to offer what you, I mean, it's Ba'asher Hu Sham. Basically, the way I read it literally is just in which he there. Right, in which, like, heard his voice, certainly there is part of it. And basically in the place where he was, I think, is probably a good way to say it. I think that's why because it's not very smooth to say, in which he there. But that's what it says. God heard the boy's voice, in which he there, And so I see this, because Sham is there, pun intended, in the text. I see this as reassurance that for us to say, God hears us where we are and as we are, And that means in joy and in distress. And more to the point, we learn that God answers prayers also in this section according to his compassion, yes, overall, but he answers according to his plans and purposes. Because in this instance, yes, God heard Ishmael where he was, where he is, but he answered and provided based on not just his compassion, but based on the promise and the purpose through Abraham. If you remember back in verses 12 and 13 when he was assuring Abraham, like, look, everything's going to be fine, it's all still part of this thread of, I'm going to take care of all this because he's your seed. There's still that idea of seed and the promise that's all wrapped up in this section. And so he answers, hears us where we are, as we are, based on his compassion, but also on his plans and his promises. And another thing that spoke to me and helped me here was understanding that for those of us with children, we can only take them so far. And just like Hagar did, she only took, sometimes maybe you feel like dropping your kid off under a bush in the desert, I don't know. But wait till you're tired, at least wait till you're exhausted and can't go any further until you do that. But you can only take them so far. And at the end of the day, you need to understand and accept that your children really don't belong to you. And that's a hard one to accept, but they belong to God. And just as we see here in the picture with Hagar and Ishmael, God picks up our kids where we fall off and fail. Because she was done. She couldn't do anything else. Actually, I thought, no one talked about this, but it said he was about a bow shot away. I thought, well, that's interesting. Why say that? Did she have a bow? Like, was she, seriously, was she going to put him out of his misery? I don't know. He became a hunter later, so there's a little odd bow thing. I'm just sharing. I don't have an answer for it, but no one mentioned the possibility that Hagar was going to shoot him, but that's what I thought. Why say she's a bow? You're about as far away from me right now as I could probably throw my shoe at real accurately. It's like, why would I say that, unless I was planning on... So, anyways. But back to I'm going to digress. But anyways, in all seriousness, God picks up for our kids where we leave off, right? Even before that, quite frankly. But also, we see assurance here that through the angel, God says, don't be afraid, for I'll make him a great nation. So in this desperate situation of being out in the desert, that's the first thing he says. Don't worry. I know you're thinking about to die right now, but takes care of that long-term big picture. That's a reassurance of the long-term provision. But then we also see that God provides for the immediate needs too. Verse 19 says he opens Hagar's eyes to see a source of water that they obviously desperately needed at that moment. I don't believe this is a miraculous poof that the oasis was there, like in Bugs Bunny or something, but that it was there. It didn't miraculously, but there's nothing in the text that leads us to think that Hagar had temporary blindness and now she was healed of that and her eyes were physically, literally opened. It's figurative here. He opened her eyes to see a source of water that was there all along. It's just that it was unseen. There's nothing in the text to me that seems to suggest anything otherwise. And this is another, I think, good prayer and encouragement for us to hold on to. And namely, that in our moment of need and perhaps even in our moment of desperation, is that God will enlighten us and cause us to see what we need to see. We saw that earlier with, God lifting up Abraham's eyes, whereas Lot lifted up his own eyes. We saw that same thing there as well. And so that thing that we're looking for, that thing that we need, that we desperately need, might very well be right in front of us now, like I believe it was for Hagar. But we just need the Lord to open our eyes to it. And the lesson for us to accept, I think, is that without God, even a well, even the absolute source of provision that is needed, which is right in front of you, it's going to be missed without God opening your eyes to it. I think that's the lesson to accept. And the end of this section tells us that Hagar and Ishmael, that they made it, they lived. Ishmael got married, continued his life in the wilderness. And, he had a different destiny than Isaac, for sure, but not outside of the scope of God's purposes. I mean, verse 20 is very clear. It tells us that God was with the boy, speaking of Ishmael there. And he and Hagar's life had certainly been full of all kinds of trouble, right? If you go back to 16 and look what happened there just when this whole thing started with her and Ishmael. There was trouble. She'd been out kind of in this desperate situation a couple times. And you know what? It wasn't her fault. And quite frankly, it was due to Abraham, all of her things that have happened, And so the thing there is that, even like we saw last week with Abimelech and, that how God prevented him from offending himself and Sarah and Abraham, is that our actions towards others are ultimately towards God, like I said. But they do impact others, as we see this impact on Hagar here. This wasn't a fun time for her either, or Ishmael. And again, they were a direct result of Abraham's doing. This wasn't God sending her out into the wilderness. Abraham did this, basically, but God protected her. And so our disobedience, our indifference maybe to others does impact them. But the Lord doesn't fail to be gracious to those people that do get hurt. So, but don't, that's not meant to be a license to say, okay, be careless, be indifferent to others, don't worry, God will take care of them even when you hurt them. That's not the point. The point is to understand that as you seek to live a life of faith, there's going to be ups and downs, but God is still there. He's still there to hear your voice, just as you are and just where you are. So let's pray. Lord, I just want to thank you for the continual evidence and the continual reminder that even when facing difficult decisions, that your hand is involved and your hand is upon us and our situations. Lord, we want to thank you also for never being too far away to hear our voice, for being, for hearing us right as we are and right where we are. And Lord, we just ask that you would help us to trust you more in all things, in all decisions, the easy ones as well as the tough ones. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. So we'll just take a few minutes here before we close our service and listen to a little bit of music, and a few of us will be available to pray with you if you'd like, and then we will conclude.